who does need some introduction, even though he asked me not to do it. So I'm gonna not fully comply with his request. And I'm carrying here a brief biography of him, but I will comply by not reading that to you. I think it's probably in your folders anyhow. So I want to tell you about the first time that I remember meeting David, although I think it might not have really been the first time. I'm trying to get out of the light. Okay. And he was invited to a sort of staff meeting where we were beginning in the Institute to think about what our stance was going to be on the fact that new standards were maybe going to come our way. It was before the Common Core State Standards effort announced, and another person we were working with, whom I won't name tonight, asked if maybe at our next meeting he could bring David Coleman with him, and I said, "Who's David Coleman?" And he gave me something like what I have in my hand. It didn't. Those characteristics didn't seem particularly relevant to what we were going to do. You know, like being a Rhodes Scholar and having both Cambridge and Oxford degrees and all that kind of stuff. That's nice, but it's really not so relevant. But I sat up, and I remember being with Tony, who was there, when he handed out a list of 10, this was, you know, within moments of arrival from the airport, handed out a list of 10 proposed standards that at that moment, some of you probably have seen a variance of this list, at that moment seemed as reasonable as anything else for the new English standards that were going to be forthcoming. The first one said, "Read like a detective." That's it. That was standard number one. So powerful a one that it's driven out of my mind the other 9. But you have to imagine a bunch of Institute for Learning people and School of Education people, leaders in English education, I'm talking about Tony now, leaders in some kind of relationship between psychology and schooling, and most or some subset of our fellows, ones involved in English language arts. And we took a look at this, and my memory is there was a long moment of silence, right, Tony? Do you remember that too, David? And what I really want to say is that reading like a detective is part of our core standard. It's not there in words, but it informs. That was a kind of inventive way to put an idea on the table that established a standard very different from, I don't know what I can say, the boring ones that we grew up with and are used to, like what I put together in New Standards. You know, they were standards for English, but if anybody ever wrote that way in my books, they'd get pushed out. But Read Like a Detective would have made it into the books. And you can see, if you think about it for a minute, what that would mean. I'm not going to do it, but I'm tempted to ask you to turn to your neighbor and offer let's do it. What do you think is the definition of what does read like a detective mean to you? Let's talk about it for a second. Yeah, it worked. Okay, it worked. Now I'm going to give you the answer.
All the evidence is there, and it all matters.
Okay, so this is the kind of person we are going to be a privilege to hear tonight. He has been involved in virtually every step of setting the national standards, and he doesn't have a single credential for it. He's never taught in an elementary school, I think. I actually don't know. He's never edited a scholarly journal, but I think he has written scholarly papers, and a variety of other things that have everybody here has done some of. He hasn't done. You told me you didn't want to do a standard. So he hasn't done the standard things, and now he's going to tell you what he has done, or what he probably will say he has not done, others have done, but which he has helped others to want to do and to actually do. And we're all going to be living with the fruits of that for the next 5 years. So listen carefully.
There you go. Can you hear me? You know, you'd think someone with Lauren's experience would understand you never tell the truth when you're introducing someone. It's kind of like a eulogy in reverse. I think the clear lesson from tonight is don't ask Lauren to speak at your funeral. She clearly doesn't understand what eulogy stands for. No, thank you so much for your attention. I know it's getting late. It's after dinner now. And so I'm going to try to be brief. I'm going to talk in two parts. I'm going to first try to answer a very specific question, which is, I think, the title that Nancy and her team put together, which is, what should we do over the next 2 years? I'm going to dare to be exceedingly specific about that question, because it's a question that is very much on your minds as you're embarking on this work. And it is my style to think that anything vague in response to that question is totally not helpful. So I aim to be extremely specific and hence vulnerable to criticism. The second thing, I feel since I'm already bloodied, I might as well really go for it and teach a couple of poems in front of an excellent poet who's Tony sitting in front of me. So he might just mug me at any moment during the second part of it, where we're going to look at two poems together, because I thought that would be fun, a kind of after-dinner pleasure and an after-dinner picture of what this kind of instruction might look like. If you don't mind, I'd like to talk a minute about how this work builds on some of the work that IFL has done over the years. And it gives me a chance to basically do a very important rhetorical maneuver, which is to blame Lauren. So if there are aspects of what I'm about to say that you disagree with, if the Common Core is kind of a pain in the ass, built on top of your other duties while funding is being cut, don't blame me, blame Lauren. Because there is clearly no way this country would be talking about 46 states adopting a set of common standards had not a somewhat younger, still revolutionary mind thought that this nation needed a new set of standards. And for that, I am most grateful to you. I've learned some other things with Lauren along the way. One of them is the kind of humility she talked about qualifications. I actually think it's really important to try to base what I'm about to say to you on evidence I share with you rather than on the sands of my qualifications. So if I ask you or talk to you about doing something, it should be evident that it makes sense to you to do, because I have no other authority. I will talk to you about what the standards say, because you're looking to me to do that. But I also hope to talk to you about evidence we encountered along the way of developing that we found overwhelming and compelling. Enough so that we deemed it essential to act on for the safety and well-being of children. Lauren, though, has challenged me over the years with some more ideas, and some I want to put on the table for you. All in the sake of striking back. One of them is that these standards are worthy of nothing if the assessments built on them are not worthy of teaching to. Period. This is quite a demanding charge, I might add to you, because it has within it the kind of statement, you know, oh, the standards were just fine, but the real work begins now in defining the assessment, which, if you were involved in the standards, is a slightly exhausting statement to make. But let's be rather clear. We're at the start of something here, and its promise, our top priority as an organization, I'll tell you a little bit more about our organization, is to do our darndest to ensure that the assessment is worthy of your time, is worthy of imitation. It was Lauren who propounded the great rule that I think is a statement of reality, though not a pretty one, which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand-waving. There's no amount of saying they teach to the standards, not the test, we don't do that here, whatever. The truth is, and if I misrepresent you, you are welcome to take the mic back, but the truth is teachers do. Tests exert an enormous effect on instructional practice, direct and indirect. And it's hence our obligation to make tests that are worthy of that kind of attention. It is, in my judgment, the single most important work we have to do over the next 2 years to ensure that that is so. Period. So when you ask me, what do we have to do over the next 2 years? We got to do that. If we do anything else over the next 2 years and don't do that, we are stupid and shall be betrayed again by shallow tests that demean the quality of classroom practice. Period. I could talk also about things I've learned from Tony and things I've learned from the team he works with, but they're going to so disagree with what I'll say next that I don't want to shame them by associating themselves with my work any further. But let me begin. I want to give you an outline of the core standards, the evidence on which they're based, but I want to be very practical, if that's okay. I think you've heard enough about the standards in general terms. So I want to, if it's okay with you, cut to the quick and be like, if I was a superintendent, like my friend Clayton over here, back in the saddle, congratulations, that's wonderful. If I were a superintendent and his team, what exactly would I do year 1 and year 2, based on evidence, based on what the standards demand, that will help my children, even though I get it, the state tests are not going to change over those 2 years. And you have to perform on existing metrics. You are caught in a bind, and I want to be honest about it. Right? You've got the Common Core, and you've got your existing state standards in work. And if you're truly screwed, you're in Texas. My friends from Texas in the back are like, can we leave now and go to a bar? Because we didn't even adopt these stupid standards yet. But I want to try to talk to you tonight about things I think are worth doing anyway. Does that make sense? That is, I want to talk to you about work worth doing that I think will aid your performance on existing instruments and far more on the instruments to come. Am I being clear? I am only interested in things you can actually do. This is not, I'm not in a dreamy moment conversation type thing. I'm interested in taking seriously the facts as they are before you. That is, the real people you have now working with you and for you, the real kids now in front of you with their deficits and all their needs, etc. So with that in mind, I'm about to jump in, but I'm just going to say one word about my own organization, which is Student Achievement Partners. Student Achievement Partners, all you need to know about us are a couple of things. One is we're composed of that collection of unqualified people who were involved in developing the common standards. And our only qualification was our attention to and command of the evidence behind them. That is, it was our insistence in the standards process that it was not enough to say you wanted to or thought that kids should know these things, that you had to have evidence to support it, frankly because it was our conviction that the only way to get an eraser into the standards writing room was with evidence behind it. Because otherwise, the way standards are written, you get all the adults into the room about what kids should know, and the only way to end the meeting is to include everything. That's how we've gotten to the typical state standards we have today. The notion of evidence was a way to do two things, was to focus on what mattered most and to erase much of which surrounded it. I think that core principle will be the most important single one for you to take away tonight. If you see these standards as an addition to your current tasks, as one more burden on an overburdened cart, you will fail. If after my remarks it is not absolutely clear how much you can stop doing and what you can focus on instead doing, we're nowhere. We do not have the resources, leisure, or time to invest in a whole new set of initiatives around these Common Core standards. Is that clear? We have to clearly understand what is removed. Teachers need to understand what is removed. What is removed to make way for the work that matters? Does that make sense? Otherwise, it is simply an impossible task. So I'm going to talk a lot about what goes as well as what stays. Clear enough so far? In terms of student achievement partners, we're composed largely of those people who are involved in authoring the standards and developing the evidence, even though, as it's rightly told, both teachers' unions, teachers from throughout the country, parents, 48 states, everybody was involved in writing these standards. So I'm only talking about writing in a manner of speaking. But we were involved in developing them and had an occasional turn of phrase like reading like a detective, which Tony Petrosky wrote me the single most beautiful email about that I still keep a printed copy of nearby as to what that really means. But briefly, we, the authors of the standards, hold on to three principles now going forward. Those of us who have joined Student Achievement Partners, they are the following. Always be overwhelmed by loud voices in back of you. There are three. So those of us who have chosen to work together have chosen three principles. Number one, we do not and will not accept money from the publishers of any curriculum or assessment at any time, whether for-profit or not-for-profit. The second interesting one is we will not compete for any state or district RFPs. We adopt this second one because we believe in a vibrant market of other people competing for these things. Also, because we think that district and state RFPs tend to suck. We think that if states and districts are going to get better stuff, they have to rewrite the requests. Does that make sense? That if the RFPs are weak, so the vendor community reaction is weak. And it would be stupid if we were trying to write the RFPs and then compete for them. So when I talk to you tonight, it is, if any mistake I make intellectually or socially, is solely a result of our stupidity, but not a result of our avarice or desire for material gain. The third principle is we have no intellectual property of our own, which hopefully does not mean that we have no ideas. It does mean, however, that anything I share with you and anything we in the future share with you, exemplars, anything, you can take, reuse, make better, especially without attribution. Nothing bothers me more when it's like, copyright this group, please say that. No, unnecessary. And after I'm done, you'll want to distance yourselves as much from me as possible, so that probably helps you. But I really mean it. So everything we develop and give is usable, reusable, changeable, without any cost or attribution. So those are our three principles. And now let's get to what do I mean tonight about what you should be doing over the next 2 years regarding the standards. Let's start with math and then do literacy. I'll probably spend a little more time on literacy because as weak as my qualifications are there, in math they are even more desperate in their lacking. In mathematics, the most shocking thing about the high-performing countries that are beating the pants off us in math, see, I think there's an image in this country about the East Asian countries and other high-performing countries in math. If we were all interviewed, I think we have a shared picture in private, which is this. They're working harder than we are. Their kids work harder. They may not be quite as creative, but that's only going to last for so long, and this country's best days, we're going to get overwhelmed by this kind of tidal wave of harder work. That's, I think, the basic feeling of the American country today. Strikingly, though, the Singapore website, as Lauren's great friend Phil Darrow has pointed out, does not say, work harder, do more, which is what we expect it to say. It says, in fact, teach less, learn more. What is most striking about the high-performing countries in mathematics is they focus on far fewer topics and do them with much greater depth and sophistication than we do here. To be precise, in kindergarten through second grade, 3 and only 3 topics are common to the high-performing countries in mathematics. Those are whole numbers, their operations, and the quantities they measure. That's it. Following that focus, the Common Core standards now adopted focus relentlessly in kindergarten through second grade on the addition and subtraction of whole numbers and the quantities they measure. You could describe kindergarten through second grade as a master class in addition and subtraction. Interestingly, for my friends in Texas, deliberately in high-performing countries, fractions are postponed. One thing that is so stupid about whose standards are higher is the kind of, if you introduce it earlier, you're higher. I think you're only higher in the kind of pot-induced fantasy rather than the reality of performance. That is, it's not higher to introduce these things earlier. It's, in fact, doesn't allow for the real mastery and muscularity of performance around whole numbers. In 3rd through 5th grade, as I've hinted, the mighty art enters that most precedes and predicts algebraic performance, which is fractions. And its closely related ideas of division and subtraction. Because obviously fractions are already beginning to show you what division looks like, as well as what multiplication means. Those core capacities over 3rd through 5th grade pave the way for proportional reasoning, of course, and expansion to the rest of the number system, and if you're working at a deliberate speed in math, to handle linear equations in algebra in grade 8. That, in mathematics, think of it like a trunk of a tree or the handle of a fork. This core of math is necessary for all the future work you can do in math and enables all the future work. That is, with command of those arenas of mathematics and those arenas alone, you can do tremendous work in data analysis, advanced work in algebra, and like the calculus and the trigonometry, as well as modeling and multiple representation. Obviously, along with focus comes depth. That is, when I say just do fewer things, it's not like, woohoo, holiday, we can just do less stuff and go home earlier, right? It means that you do those things at a greater depth. What exactly do I mean by depth? I mean 3 things. I mean fluency, application, and understanding. By fluency in math, I want you to imagine being fluent in French or another foreign language, where you do not hesitate to solve a problem. There are a few key fluencies. The standards are strict in identifying only 1 to 2 per year in kindergarten through 8th grade. But of these things, yes, people have to have memory. Yes, practice. Yes, rote in a sense, a kind of ability of fluency through repeated practice. Sometimes people on the left are very uncomfortable with that, but for those areas of math, it's extremely important you have that fluidity. But at the same time, around those core areas, application and understanding matter equally. So when I say application in math, that's your ability to apply math to a situation even when you're not asked to do so. And you can see the importance of that when someone's about to rip you off with the mortgage. They rarely say it's a good time to do the math. You should consider pulling out a calculator right now. Math is only powerful, and I'm sure all of you notice this in your lives, that math is powerful in career and college because mathematical people have this awesome power to choose to apply it when the rest of the people aren't. They see at a moment that a key ratio is operating that breaks the problem. It's not that someone handed them a problem and said, this is a ratio right now. So if math is to have its power, it must have application built into it. And of course, understanding is the ability to apply that core set of math to surprising and new problem types, to a wide range of problem types. What then does this mean for assessment? Because we're going back to that. I think one of the most simple reasons that teachers do not trust assessment today, and parents do not, is a very simple problem. I'm going to put it as simply as I can. There is on average at least 40 topics annually in the American mathematics curriculum, period. Does anyone know what the average number of questions is on a standardized test? 40, good guess. What that means is on a standardized test, you typically have at best 2, maybe 3 questions on a topic, and then you're not going to cover some of the others. So it's like Russian roulette. What's going to get examined this year? And at best, I get none of us, no psychometrician, Lauren's much more sophisticated at that stuff than I am, but basically, the more items you have to explore someone's understanding of something, the more reliable your understanding of their understanding is going to be. And the more different ways you can see them explore, right? Imagine for a moment if 50 to 70% of an exam, instead of being all over the place, focused on the major mathematics work of that grade. And the reason why that would be so honest is without that mathematical mastery, these students are not, in fact, going forward. Math tests as they are today are actually an illusion because you can pass them without a mastery of the math you really need to go forward. Do you see what I'm saying? If you get all this other patterns and all this other stuff we do in early grades, do some data problems, bait and switch, jump around a little bit, jump to the next topic, but you don't have fractions, you are truly screwed, but you may have passed the test. Do you see the problem? So when we redesign assessment, focus is one of the most important principles, so that it offers an in-depth, diverse look at the masteries that matter most. And that way it offers what we should look for in assessment, which is something like a job description or a set of priorities that really affect you, that say, without this, students shall not go forward, and hence, in my classroom, they are subject of concentration. So, in mathematics, focus and its closely related concepts of coherence and depth. Focus, coherence, so it builds on one another, and depth are at the heart of these math standards. We could do a lot more on math, but I want to pause now and say, okay, got it, what the heck do I do about it? And what do I do about it over a 2-year period? I'm going to answer you in ruthlessly blunt terms. Year 1, already we're talking about like the spring at best. Right? I mean, we're here in December. You know, are we talking year 1 being next year? If you're going to do anything fast, I think you lead with focus. The most important single idea in these mathematics standards is that some math is much more important than others. This is confused by all instructional materials that are put in front of teachers because they present it all as if it's equally important. Do you see the problem? That is a deliberate confusion. It's not so. There's a core of math that matters a lot more. So if you don't get in K2 addition and subtraction of whole numbers, the quantities they measure, you're really in trouble. And if you master it, you're really you see what I'm saying? So what I say to you this year is do a few things about focus for sure. Number 1, before you get new great, I would love to tell you that I have new great mathematical curricula for you, which examines the focus areas and beautiful depth and ability. That's year 2 or 3, right? Let's just admit it. When publishers are telling you they already have great Common Core aligned materials in mathematics, I hope you have a little skepticism in you. Because it's amazing that they developed them before the core standards were developed. But what you can do is take your existing work and really focus. So what we've given you in your folders is a description of the major work in math for each grade. And we will follow up and share with IFL, our partners, as we refine our sense of what the priorities in math are, we'll give it to you. Now, so what I'm saying is, first I would go through your existing curricula. I would make sure first that your teachers know, every teacher, the major work of each grade. It's like a couple of sentences long, so I'm not talking about like a crazy. They should know the key fluencies for every grade. Period. Then, you as a district or together, what we can do is go through existing curricula and find those, and at least make more time so that teachers can spend the time and work to have the time to teach and their students can have time to practice towards those areas. Am I making sense? That's phase 1. Most state standards based on any calculus take about 30 years to deliver. So it is okay to begin with focus, if you get my gist. The game in math in America has been quite damaging because the things I'm talking about, which sounds like arithmetic and basic things, are actually very difficult. Make no mistake, fractions are hard, as any of you know who have really wrestled with them. And so what we've done is we've given kids and teachers the out of moving on to the next topic. There's always, if you don't get that, move on to the next topic. And that's not how math works. Without those core areas, the door is in fact closed. So the first thing I do is go through existing materials, focus it. Number 2, all your professional development spending in year 1 goes towards what? The major work of the grade. Period. No negotiation. Only professional development in the district, major work of the grade. 3, interim assessment, your other tool right before you. What does it focus on? Overwhelmingly the major work of the grade. Now you may say, this is a little spooky, Dave, because I still got dumb state test coming that measures the whole waterfront. And I'm a superintendent, and I'm fighting for my life every year. Hong Kong covers, in its curriculum, half of the topics that are on the TIMSS International Math Test. Half of them are in the Hong Kong curriculum, 50%. The US covers all of the TIMSS topics in our curriculum. Who performs better on the TIMSS test? Like by a lot. It's like not even close. Why? Because the core of math I'm describing to you is so flexible and powerful that it applies to most of the other math at the grade. Do you see what I'm saying? So it is a safe bet to begin focusing now, and then in my second year, I would drive depth as much as possible. I would introduce some depth this year, that is the notions of fluency, application, understanding, but it's going to take time to gradually teach teachers what does application understanding look like in their specific areas of fractions, et cetera. That, I think, unfolds in year 2. By then, tools will have begun to develop that will be more helpful, so I would lead with focus and then go to depth. That's my personal view, given the limits you have. That's what I would do in mathematics. So I'm going to pause for a minute on math before I jump into literacy, where we'll spend a bit more time. And you also are welcome to disagree with me if I've gotten something terribly wrong. See, it's good. I got you late after some food. Any questions about mathematics for this year right now? Concerns? That's because you're from Texas, ma'am. I know she's not. I was just trying to get another cheap shot in at Texas.
This is a person from Pittsburgh, so let's
I know. I was joking. I have a bad sense of humor. I will speak louder. I find that the softer I speak, the less people can argue with me. I will speak up. I'm sorry about that. I think that this mic may not quite do it. I think if I use this mic, it's louder. Is that right? Okay. I'll use the mic from now on. Anything else? Yeah.
One of the things that struck me when you were describing year 1, and what I thought about is that it really will require teachers to be real experts in their subject matter.
I'm going to repeat just in case people didn't hear because you didn't have the mic in front of you. She said that as I described year 1, teachers would have to be experts in their subject matter because they're really going to be spending more time on fewer things. I'm going to actually say the opposite, just for fun. Year 1, your teachers are not expert yet. I'm assuming they've learned nothing more. I've just begun as a superintendent or leadership team to realign professional development around the focus areas, but it's just beginning to hit. I got kind of the same people I had before. I'm just being blunt. We haven't been able to make them experts yet. All we're doing year 1 is saying, take time with this stuff. Around this stuff, take time examining your students, work towards greater mastery, do this work and do it well. It's your absolute top priority. They are not yet stronger. Year 2, now that you've invested all your professional development, focused they've spent much more time with these materials, now you're ready to gradually make teachers more expert. And what's nice is, teacher expertise is easy to say, but harder to achieve, right? But at least you're achieving it around a more focused area. So at least now you've cleared the field and you're not saying be expert equally in everything in mathematics. You're saying be disproportionately expert at a few things that matter. So I think we have to look for teacher expertise as an investment in year 1 and beginning to deliver in year 2 and following, just in terms of being candid. Yeah, please.
You mentioned something about Singaporean math and Hong Kong math
Yeah.
as the leading successful in
Yeah.
terms of mathematics. Do you say the same thing for Japanese mathematics as well?
You know, there's some very interesting work on Japan, which I'm not expert, but around, there's some wonderful research around kind of both actually separately done in Japan and some work actually in China, which are, of course, very different places, but a similar practice around elementary school teachers doing relatively deep learning work around these core areas of arithmetic that looks very promising. And a lot of people ask us about Singapore math, for example, because there is a product with that name. I'm not ready yet, nor will we likely ever as Student Achievement Partners kind of say, look at this is a good product yet. We're letting the market unfold, and I think every product we've seen could use this focus and attempt. And I think that there's going to be some very interesting work over the next few years as math focuses on what matters to find what international examples are most lively. Literacy, everyone's like, he better get going to literacy because we got to go home. Okay, literacy. I'm sure all of you know the kind of haunting data that surrounds literacy in this country. I find the most haunting data the NAEP data in 8th grade reading performance, because if you look at 8th grade NAEP performance, it is a tabletop. It has been flat for about 40 years. During which time we have doubled or tripled educational expenditures. So in my personal judgment, we have hit a wall in later literacy. That is, we simply, despite all the work in early reading over the past few years, which has been debated as to its impact, but the most optimistic would argue has led to some growth in 4th grade reading and some greater command. 8th grade reading scores have remained absolutely flat. And I don't think I need to argue with you or discuss with you how devastating that is, because if a student can't read past the 8th grade level, they're obviously doomed in terms of career and college readiness and all we hope for them. So I want you to look at the core standards for a moment as a battering ram, as an engine to take down that wall. That was our core design principle in thinking about them. So how do they attempt to do that? And then I'm going to talk to you about some of their limits, what they haven't fixed, and some more depths. And then I want to again talk about the 2 or 3 things you can do about it this year and next year. So in the core standards, the first major shift in instruction is a focus on reading to build knowledge in both elementary school and after it. So what's most shocking about elementary school in this country for many people is overwhelmingly what students read in K-5 today is stories. There is data that only 7 to 15% of what students now read during elementary school is informational text. Informational text is not a beautiful word, like reading like a detective, for example. But informational text in this case has a lot of beauty in it because it includes reading about science, history, the arts. It is everything that is non-literary in that sense. Everything. Now, of course, literature has its own knowledge, and through the contributions of Massachusetts and other states, I love the K-5 literature standards and think they explore carefully the structure of stories and of mythology and poetry and drama in a wonderful way. But that is not enough. The data is overwhelming that from kids from various backgrounds especially, that the knowledge that they gain in kindergarten through 5th grade, as well as including pre-K, by the way, the knowledge that attends on them, including the vocabulary closely related to them, is absolutely essential for reading more complex text going forward. So the big shift in the Common Core Standards is it demands that 50% of the work of elementary schools is based on informational text, on learning about the world. And when you look at the kind of unintended consequences of standards and assessments, what happened, as you know, is we only tested reading and writing in the elementary school, or reading and math, to be precise. And since then, reading only was reading literature, everyone expanded the literacy blocks, right? So in other words, how many people in this room have extended literacy blocks to ensure their students read at a young age? Most, right? If during that time they're reading mostly literature, or overwhelmingly so, what have you done? You've, by extending the literacy portion, banished history and science from the elementary school. What is most exciting for elementary school teachers about these standards is that they reinaugurate elementary school teachers' rightful role as guides to the world. It is a change in their job description to say it is right and just that you bring your students into a world of knowledge during the years they are in your care. And it is crucial that they do so, that that knowledge is built in a coherent way within grades as well as across grades. And there's an example of this in the standards in the text on the human body in a sample succession of texts. That extends through later grades in the fact that these standards are not only standards for English language arts, but standards also for literacy in history and social studies, as well as science and technical subjects. And that's an area where IFL has been a voice, you could say in the wilderness if you had a biblical cast of mind, for quite many years. It's not like this is a new idea to this crowd that we should read and write across the curriculum, but this is the first body of academic standards. It makes it a requirement equally for students and teachers. I am sick of people, to be rather frank with you, who tell me that our teachers don't want to teach this because our kids have to be able to do it, period, for their success. And what's interesting about the standards is rather than saying to social studies and history teachers that they should become reading teachers, which I think is a losing game, it says instead they must enable their students to evaluate and analyze primary and secondary sources. Science teachers must not become literary teachers. What they must become is teachers who enable their students to read primary sources of the sort of direct experimental results, as well as reference documents to build their knowledge of science. But what is not allowed is a content teacher to think that if they just tell their students enough content and their students have no independent capacity to analyze and build that content knowledge, that they are a success. Clear? So the second principle behind building knowledge is that content area teachers are absolutely responsible for the academic literacy of their students. I think this is particularly important for you in middle school. If you do not get your middle school teachers on board with getting their students truly ready to read increasingly more complex scientific and historical text, you are doomed to failure. I'm just kind of telling you. I think the data is rather clear. When students reach high school without those capacities, there's almost no high school we've invented that can repair the harm. So we got to do it, okay? So in terms of year one plans, that will figure prominently. The second shift in reading is reading and writing based on evidence. And Lauren beautifully described the notion of reading based on evidence. That is, reading like a detective. The respect and reverence that demands that the text is the first source of evidence. What we found striking is we looked at instruction, actually, and I don't mean this just because of my joking tonight, we looked at it in 2 states. We tried to pick 2 states that were similar as possible. So we picked Vermont and Texas. And what we found was in those 2 states, there was a remarkable similarity, which is that upwards of 80% of the questions that students were asked when talking about a text were answerable without direct reference to the text in front of you. That is, they were about it. You know, like what it connected to, what it made you think about, big questions, small questions, all sorts of questions, but not questions that required you to demonstrate an evidentiary command of the text, which is essential in job-related reading, but also college-related reading. So there's a big gap. In writing, the most popular forms of writing today in the American high school are overwhelmingly, besides texting, which is not for credit, are overwhelmingly a narrative of either your personal opinions or what you think. What you feel or what you've experienced. So a narrative either of your experience or your opinions. And assessments, to Lauren's point, follow this pattern. So if you look at the NAEP or the MCAS, there are all these weird questions on tests. Describe your favorite day. I'm not making this up. Who are your heroes? Are they like athletes or are they supermodels or sports stars? Tell us and why. What do you think of honor? Supermodels I made up. That's just my own obsession. You know, garbage disposal, school uniforms, you know all this stuff. Honor, right? We are saying no, that is not college and career-ready writing. Because in college and career-ready writing, you either have to make an argument based on evidence that is visible to others than yourself, or convey complex information clearly. Narrative plays a crucial role, but as you grow older, it is to support your ability to inform or argue or make truly extraordinary imaginative literature. But in other words, it isn't standalone. as your pedestal for college and career readiness. To give you a sense of how striking the data is on this subject, in Minnesota, a group of college professors got together in what I thought was quite an imaginative move, calling themselves Ready or Not Writing. And they asked students around the state to submit essays that they would deem ready or not. They got over 90% narrative writing and deemed over 90% of it not college ready. Period. So it's consequential what we ask kids and teachers to do. The third shift in the standards is a shift of emphasis towards the complexity of text. What we've often had in reading standards, and we've tried our best to avoid this in our own, is false distinctions between reading skills across grades. So in 6th grade, you understand a character's motivation. Does this sound familiar? In 8th grade, you understand their underlying motivation. Well, you know, as a New Yorker, I can tell you that most people's motivations are underlying unless they're mugging you. So it's not that helpful a distinction. What does change over time is not the skills with which you read, but your ability to do them with more and more complex texts, with increasing depth as those texts demand. These standards, for the first time, create an explicit staircase of text complexity, because the other worrisome data we have is that we have systematically reduced the complexity of text in students' hands, while the demands of college have not changed, and career. And for all those snobs who think college is so much better than career or technical subjects, the average demand of career and technical text is slightly higher than that of a first-year college course, though they hover around the same level. There's been really exciting work in measuring text complexity. Two leaders in figuring that out for us are David and Meredith Lieben, who are over there, who convened, with help from IFL and others, all the leading researchers in how you measure this. There's been some great works by Cometrics and other leaders, and Tom Landauer were talking about all sorts of interesting work in how you measure this. But for your sakes, the really exciting thing is, for the first time, there's a measure in the standards that insists that students at each level are encountering text of adequate complexity. Nonetheless, you could nonetheless be defeated, because the most popular instructional practice for students who are behind is to replace their core reading with leveled text at their level. Right? So if you were to actually look at what your kids are being given, they are constantly matched in this seeming noble idea that you should match everything they read to where they are today, often called the proximal zone of development, etc. Let me be rather clear. Leveled readers and reading at your own level has a crucial role to play for kids in terms of their vocabulary growth, their love of reading, and has a very important role. So I'm not saying kind of just get rid of it, but what I am saying is the core of instruction, if we want kids to catch up, has to be the deliberate study of sufficiently complex text. Again and again, we cannot exclude students from that and expect them to magically catch up. That's a scaffolded environment, do you get me? Where their frustration, they are expected to be frustrated, that frustration is managed as part of the classroom community, and they engage repeatedly in dealing with things that are more difficult than they can handle. One of the reasons, tragically, we're seeing kids who can read at a 4th grade level then fall more and more behind is if we just give them stuff they're comfortable with, they'll never make it past that next level of complexity, which is the 8th grade text. Am I making sense? So what schooling has to become is the deliberate encounter of sufficiently complex text. Where level text plays an independent role, there's also intervention and other support. And of course, there's the attendant vocabulary of complex text, which involves, as you know, not just domain-specific vocabulary like cell wall or amoeba, but the kinds of words that are prevalent in all complex texts, like the word prevalent itself, or hypothesis or consequence. These words are often not helpfully highlighted or in bold on the right side of a page as you're reading, and if teachers don't pay attention to teaching them, they're an invisible wall which prevents students from reading anything of sufficient complexity. Those are the 3 rough changes, the rough shifts. By focusing on those, I don't mean to exclude several other critical parts of reading instruction, so let me just clarify that. In K2 in particular, and going forward for kids who need it, a strong dose of foundational skills for those students who need it is absolutely essential, and those skills are outlined with care in the core standards. So I didn't mean to say we can leave that stuff out all of a sudden. That systematic instruction remains essential, particularly for students who are behind or don't get reading immediately. Practice in fluency remains essential and will be more demanding as students are reading more complex text. Vocabulary, as you can sense from what I'm talking about, built through reading and developing knowledge from the earliest grades, is a constant obsession of reading instruction. And when I talk to you soon about reading something carefully, you'll notice there's a constant attention to syntax, to the structure of language in everything you're doing. So, given what I've said about literacy, what would I do about it? I'm going to give you a few quick things to do. Number one, and the biggest for year one, is to build a culture of citing evidence in the classroom when you write and speak about text, period. That is, when students say something about a text, dare I say, they might be accountable for their talk and refer to the evidence on which their statements are made. You'll find this accountability is also a check on the teachers. Do you see it works both ways? If teachers are constantly asking, where's the evidence in the text for your answer? It's harder to ask a question which doesn't require evidence in the text. Do you see? It's like an interesting, it's like cool, it works both ways, right? It works in science, it works in history, it works in social studies. So I would do a campaign around evidence-supported answers in your districts this year, period. Does that make sense? I mean it as the simplest of fundamental shifts. Honoring evidence. Other things I would do this year. So one is the focus on evidence. So I would look for 20%. We said today, I would love you to do your own survey. So walk around to classrooms and see what percentage of classes have text-dependent questions when they study a piece of literature, history, science, where kids need to read the text in front of them to answer. My aim is to get to 80%, and I would expect that you will be in 20 to 30 if you're lucky. So that's a year one shift. The second shift, of course, is the text students are reading. So in year one, what you're trying to do is get more informational text into the elementary school. Okay? There are various curricula, but I'm not yet ready to recommend and just say go to one. It's like mathematics. It will take time for coherent curricula to develop in the early years. But for now, flooding the zone with knowledge in K-5 is not a bad move. Do you see what I'm saying? Just developing a much more balanced sense of the role of knowledge-based reading as well as literary reading in K-5. In 6th through 12th grade, I would challenge my science, history, and ELA teachers in the following way. Pick at least 3 texts, I'm being really careful here, that are worthy of careful reading, and gain as much knowledge and insight as you can from those texts with your students. So when you say history teachers are teaching, I want to be very clear what I mean, because history teachers or social science teachers say, we already have text in our classroom. We have the textbook, we have other texts. But let me give you an example classroom. If you are teaching Madison's Federalist Paper 51, and you're a history teacher, and you say, we're going to discuss today what are the 3 things about faction you really need to know, and you give them those things, and you've got the text, you quote it every now and then, that is not gaining knowledge through reading, right? Because you can talk a lot about faction. We all got a lot of faction. But that is not the same as reading Madison to find, if you instead handed out a single page of Federalist Paper 51 and said, based on this text and this text alone, what can you discern Madison means or does not mean by faction? Then you are reading. Am I being clear? That's what I mean by a text-dependent question, where there's no answer but looking closer at the text in front of you. I'm saying for science and history teachers, they choose at least 3 sources to examine with that kind of care. And English language arts, they should choose some combination of literature like that, and also what we call in the standards literary nonfiction. Literary nonfiction is nonfiction written for a broad audience. And here I don't mainly mean memoir or autobiography or biography, even though that is literary nonfiction. I mean literary nonfiction in the standards is about literary nonfiction that conveys information or an argument, like the founding documents of this country. The Gettysburg Address, that's actually not a founding document, but in response to them, but the Declaration, the preamble of the Constitution, and then the great conversation that unfolds after them, the Gettysburg Address, the letter from Birmingham jail, etc., etc. for freedom of speech. That's a vibrant source of text that this country has that has its rightful role in the ELA as well as the history classroom, because perhaps in no American writing is there a finer fusing of thought and word than in those writings. And hence they are very worthy of an English language arts teacher's attention. So that would be the second thing I would do, is infuse the curriculum with those texts and challenge those teachers. So I want to give you an example of how I would align. I'm going to enter a dark territory here because it's controversial, but I figure you already probably dislike me, so why not just go a little bit further? How many of you are working on teacher evaluation at the same time as you're working on these standards? That's really fun, right? To evaluate your teachers on the last set of standards while you're trying to inaugurate a new set of standards before the measures are really viable and hold them accountable today. It's a really very smart system we've developed. I want to try to cut through it. I'm going to say something kind of controversial. I think there are two sets of phrases in teacher evaluation that are kind of dead on arrival. What I mean by that is they seem to have meaning, but they don't anymore. One is use data to inform instruction. Like, thank you so very much for that insight. I think your teachers are looking back at you when you say this, and they're like, whatever. It is like no gas in the car, unless we are much more specific. The second vacuous statement is plan, engage, revise. Like, you know these categories of these teacher evaluation frameworks? Like, please help me. Have a clear objective, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? If there is anyone who can prove that has led to better teaching, I would invite it. But imagine how deadly it is to your average teacher to hear these kind of vague phrases thrown at them. So I'm going to throw at you instead, in literacy, 5 questions you could ask as a part of teacher observation that might actually not be reductive and stupid. This is controversial territory to wade into, but I think it's kind of interesting because you're doing it, why not make it productive? Number 1, is there a text or texts under discussion? And if there are they of a sufficiently high quality and complexity? Period. I think you'd be surprised to see how many classrooms the answer is no to the first part of the question. It's very hard to teach people to read better when there's no text under discussion. Number 1, is there a text under discussion, and what is its complexity or quality? Number 2, what are the quality of the questions asked about the text? Are they text dependent? Are they coherent? Are they worth answering? Do they encourage students to attend to what's interesting or specific in this text? 2. Number 3, is there evidence of students drawing from the text in their speaking and writing? Number 4, how diverse a set of students is that evidence available? That is there evidence not just some, but all students are speaking and writing using evidence from the text? And don't only look at, please, who you see talking in a classroom or their apparent engagement, because when you teach like this, really focused on evidence within a text, there are moments of highly productive frustration and silence, where a student might be rethinking and wondering and highly engaged, but keeping their mouth shut. But you do want to see it emerge in their writing, of course, if they're not speaking in it. Number 5, what is the quality of teacher feedback, of the feedback students receive on that work that we've gathered, and its growth? To me, that is a much more exciting set of criteria to engage with a literacy teacher about than did you have a plan? How are your objectives? Were your students engaged? Who can determine these things? The things I just described to you are countable. That is, in the best meaning of accountable, they are literally things you can count. And so I'd ask you to think about literacy in this way. While literacy seems like the most mysterious and vague and kind of touchy-feely of our disciplines, I think it can be much improved by daring to count within literacy and by daring to observe the accumulation of these kinds of facts. Does that make sense as a beginning? In the second year of literacy, what I'm hoping is that we will have developed, and others together with us, a much finer set of exemplars for your teachers to use. We are already open source publishing a set of exemplars of looking at fewer texts more carefully. Just like in math, there's a real slowdown in literacy. If you're going to work on more complex texts, you have to slow down. Our model of the Gettysburg Address recommends 3 to 5 days of instruction on those 3 short paragraphs. On the letter from Birmingham jail, at least 2 weeks to carefully analyze that remarkable argument and its shape. That's before you go on to additional sources and making comparisons and synthetic moves. I'm reminded by my friend Tony, this is part of instruction, these exemplars. They're not showing the whole range of it. But part of the work has to shift to reading short things worthy of rereading with care to build a culture of this kind of re-examination. Am I making sense? So you should see teachers beginning to do that work. It is near time for us to conclude. I had another kind of treat, but I'm kind of saved by not having to do with it. But I'm going to outline it for you, which is I had 2 poems to share, which are One Art by Elizabeth Bishop and Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. And for those of you who want to talk about them, I advise, and Matt, where'd you put that? Did I was gonna. I have some.
What are you looking for?
Do you have the? You have the documents, but
We
I have
have
something
them.
even better.
It's under your chair.
What? Is it under my chair? Oh, thank you. So rather than doing what I was going to do, I'll tell you a little bit what I was going to do. Which is that how many people in this very educated audience who have so much more qualifications than I do, how many of you know the derivation of the word symposium? I'm giving you a hint. To me, a great example of how far the academy has fallen from ancient Greece is the demeaning of the word symposium. Because what symposium used to mean in the good old days is to drink together. Some meaning together, and posia meaning to drink. So for those of you who want, in the bar later, to spend some time with these 2 remarkable things we won't have time to do together now, I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions about them. What are 3 things you find similar about these poems? And what are 1 or 2 that you find different? Why does Dylan Thomas, in the first line of Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, why doesn't he say gently instead of gentle? Because he's talking about you going, isn't he? Shouldn't it be an adverb? Did he make like a simple grammatical error in his finest poem? Why is the bay green? It's the only color in the poem. What's the difference in tone between these 2 poems? How do they address their obvious shared topic of loss in very different tones? What does Elizabeth Bishop mean by her joking voice? There's so much to talk about that we don't have time to. And I'm going to allow you to escape. But I hope, as you walked into classrooms, embracing the core, you'd begin to see teachers and students addressing questions of that humility and intensity about texts that matter. And with that, good night. Thank you.
David, will you take
I can't take this on the plane, so for anyone who wants some bourbon, it is here for you.
David, will you entertain a question if there's one on the
Of
floor?
course.
Okay. Any burning questions before we close? Oh, come on. Yes, sir. This is Prince George's County.
The much forgotten district.
So I actually had a question for you in June, but I've since answered it.
Okay.
But I wanted to share the insight. I heard you do Gettysburg Address.
Yeah.
And you dove right into it. And my question was going to be, in unit planning,
Yeah.
what is the scaffolding to get to Gettysburg Address? But I had the opportunity to work with a class, and I answered the question. You don't need the scaffolding. That you jump right into the high-level questioning, and the kids naturally fall into that without this sense of we have to build it from the bottom up, that you can dive right in. So thanks for not
very
answering my
moved by
question
that.
back in June.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, David.
I'll just say a word about that. This is a very contentious and complicated issue, which is the question of how much preparatory work do you need to do. And I provocatively, in the one moment I had at the end, threw these two poems at you without a short biography of Elizabeth or Dylan Thomas, and without much about these poems. Because to introduce them is to speak first. And in my view, most authors lavish a great deal of time on the way they begin. And I am hesitant to interfere with their attempt to set the table. And what the gentleman just described is a very difficult test, the Gettysburg Address. We've refrained thus far from offering the obvious contextual background you could to let students first experience its words and worry about them and wrestle with them. And that requires that you suffer some frustration and disorientation. And the question is, do we want to insulate students from that or practice them in it? Because I think good readers experience this constantly and wrestle with it, and then gradually, as they get the most they can from a text, do turn to other sources, etc. But part of this is, if you just knew, I just have to tell you, the amount of time spent pre-teaching and pre-reading would stun you. It's like in textbooks, there's like 20 pages of pre-reading material before you even get to the text in front of you. So it's something to watch out for. Yeah.
I have to say, I think I agree that we don't scaffold, but I'm not really sure I can say we don't scaffold at all.
No.
We scaffold differently, and I think that Dr. Arbogast made a good point. You don't build all that background over and over again so that students can do it. You get them right into the text,
Yep.
and it is through the class discussion that percolates up from the students that you begin to get the scaffold that's natural
I
and
wish we
authentic.
could do these two poems together, because I so agree with you. Do you learn phrases like stanza or rhyme before you start, or do they emerge as necessary as part of the discussion? But I think the big idea here is to allow the scaffolds to come as needed to understand this thing. When you try to give scaffolds independent of it, either in the form of the knowledge you need in advance, or reading skills, like the 90th lesson on cause and effect, which kids do not need, right? They know if you hit someone, it hurts them, that's cause, that's effect. That's not the problem. So it really is a lot of scaffolding because you're reading together much more slowly. I want to be clear about this word scaffolding because there's a ton of it. Every question you're asking, every time you're interpreting a particular sentence together, you're scaffolding that discussion. You're scaffolding discussion of syntax, of vocabulary, of terminology. You're just choosing to do it in the context of reading something worth reading.
David, just in closing, could you just say just one or two sentences about English language learners?
I think we were just talking about them because this is where the anxiety rests with us most. So let me be very blunt about all this with English language learners.
Go ahead.
I believe there must be a Bill of Rights for English language learners in this country. So I'm not going to talk to you about what you expect me to talk about first, which is the accommodations we must make for English language learners. I think the first thing we need to do is say they have a right to sufficiently complex text. I was with the leading publisher of ELL materials for history and social studies, and do you know what they said to me? Like not fooling said to me? We publish mainly picture books and low-level text for the students. Are you saying that has to change? And I was like, yeah. Second, they have a right to be equal before the text. That is, when I talk about all the evidence being before you and reading like a detective, I think this is a civil rights issue for these students. That they are brought into the conversation as equal partners. To interpret that, it's not a way of excluding anybody from the conversation. It's a way of saying you're all equal to it. Third, anyway, we could talk about this. They have a right to talk about academic subjects with evidence rather than constantly being asked about their own experience, which is a way, perhaps, of entertaining their adult teachers, but not of advancing their academic learning, if I may be so preposterous to say so. So I think we need a shift. And I'm willing to make enemies to do so, because I think these kids are being poorly served. However, there's a body of excellent practitioners in the English language learner community that has long been advocating for sufficient complexity, and there is a lot of scaffolding. The debate we're having, a lively one, is how much happens up front versus how much can happen within the text. And from every text, you're trying to build as much knowledge as possible. Remember what I talked about elementary school, reading more knowledge-based text? And by reading Gettysburg this way, you'll learn a lot from Lincoln about what's going on. So I love knowledge, and I love background knowledge as a strength to further reading. I just don't want to eclipse the reading of each new text by piling it on in advance. So what I'm trying to talk to you about in terms of scaffolding is, be careful that scaffolding resembles the experiences these students will have. For example, if you say before English language learners read a text, they need to watch a movie and then do this and all this other stuff, what happens on the exam? You've just created a very high-stakes moment for that child because they've never practiced reading it. Do you see what you've done to them? The exam becomes their super high-stakes moment of delivering a performance they've never delivered because you've never cultivated that. You've never said, first, how much evidence can you get from here? I know it's disorienting. Tell me what you can get. And then build from there. So we're in deep discussions with the leaders of ELL learning, and it's very exciting. But I will tell you, I think we need rights as well as accommodation, and we need a bolder view if we're going to transform the performance of these kids. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you so much for a very interesting and inspiring